Welcome to ConVerses. If you're just finding this, I strongly encourage you to watch the Gospel of the Covenant series first. There's important foundation built there that may be necessary to understand the concepts we'll be referencing as we study these apparently contradicting verses in the New Testament. Today we're going to look at the source of one of Christianity's most sacred cows. So grab your therapy pillow and hold on tight. On the first day of the week, when the disciples came together to break bread, Paul talked with them, being ready to leave in the morning. That's it? That sounds pretty harmless, but let's at least look at the mainstream assumptions that are found in this verse. 1. Sunday is not anecdotal, it is now prescribed by biblical authority. 2. Those who followed Yeshua no longer gathered on Sabbath, the seventh day of the week, but replaced it with Sunday, the first day of the week. 3. Paul abandoned the observance of Sabbath and established Sunday worship as a new sacrament for Christianity. This is the genuine doctrinal stance for many millions of believers, so it deserves our time and study to learn what's really being said here. But before we dive in, let's compare it with another verse just 2 chapters prior in Acts. And he, Paul, reasoned in the synagogue every Sabbath and persuaded the Jews and the Greeks. So according to the records of the apostles, we appear to have a major contradiction of practices, which could lead us to conclude Paul was lukewarm and did whatever was popular with the present audience because he believed the Sabbath was replaced with Sunday, but he also observed the Sabbath to convince others it was done away with. Yes, I'm being a little sarcastic here to challenge us to think rationally about our doctrines. So let's start with the first verse that many reference as the primary proof of biblically backed Sunday worship tradition. First, let's just clear up a few things by recognizing the biblical designations of a day. The Hebrew day begins at evening or sundown and continues about 24 hours until the next sundown. So, as modern Jews still practice today, the Sabbath begins at the end of the sixth day, Friday evening in our Gregorian calendar, and it goes until Saturday evening when the first day of the week begins. Now, what is consistently translated in English Bibles is the phrase, on the first day of the week. It is actually not present in the Greek in that way. It uses the miaton sabbaton, which translates to on one of the Sabbath, or maybe one of the Sabbaths. Whether it's plural or singular is part of the mystery and part of the reason I want to present 2 primary interpretations of this curious phrase. But we have to have a little Hebrew background to understand it. Sabbath in Hebrew is Shabbat. It literally means rest or ceasing or desisting. First used in Genesis 2. And Elohim blessed the seventh day and made it holy, and he rested. A related form of the word Shabbat, when referenced along with a special day of observance, is called Shabbaton, usually in reference to one of the commanded solemn days of Adonai's appointed times, such as the Day of Atonements, or the first day of the Feast of Tabernacles. In other words, marking a day to be treated like a Sabbath that wasn't necessarily the weekly seventh-day Shabbat. Now when Greek is transliterated, Shabbaton became Sabbaton. So the first possibility of the meaning of this phrase is that it is in reference to one of these special high days, treated like a Shabbat. For example, the actual context of Acts 20, as seen in verse 6, is after the days of unleavened bread. Well, what we know about the 7-day Feast of Unleavened Bread is that it begins a 7 Sabbath count to the next feast, Shavuot, or known in Greek as Pentecost, meaning 50th. Because the entire nation of Israel was trained in counting 7 Sabbaths, and the day after the 7th Sabbath, which was 49 days, was the 50th day. Shavuot also means sevens or weeks. This is the feast of the first fruit offering of the wheat harvest. So what could one of the Sabbaton mean here? One of the 7 special Sabbaths, plural, between unleavened bread and the Feast of Weeks. Why? Because all of the disciples and believers in Yeshua were continuing to observe the Torah instructions of all commanded appointed times, just like they did after his resurrection, as he told them to stay in Jerusalem for the count to Shavuot, when the Spirit would be poured out according to prophecy. There's much to be learned about the eternally commanded observances of Adonai's calendar and his appointed holy days. So I'll add some links to other trusted teachings on that below. Now, the second possibility of the interpretation, one of the Sabbaton, is a manner of counting the days of the week. Hebrews didn't have names for the days of the week. They only numbered them. Yom Rishon, Yom Shani, Yom Shlishi, etc. Because in most cultures and empires in which they lived, the names of the days of the week were dedicated to pagan gods, which, by the way, we still have today. Sunday, Moon Day, Two Day, and so on. So as it is translated in Greek, day 1 became one of the Sabbath, or one from the Sabbath. Because Sabbath was the focus of the week, the count to 7 began again. Now, day 1 would effectively equate to what we call Sunday. But as we established at the beginning, the Sabbath ended at evening on the 7th day. It was common for observant Jews to either be in the synagogue or at home resting, away from the commerce of the secular world, until the end of the day. And then they go out to socialize in the public places and or to meet together to break bread. This would present a very simple answer to the situation of Paul's meeting. The first day of the week implies after dark on our Saturday night. And the next verse provides clarity. Paul talked with them, being ready to leave in the morning, and he prolonged his speaking until midnight. Simple cultural context shows that Paul and the disciples weren't even meeting on Sunday in the modern Gregorian sense, but literally began their house meeting after Sabbath ended, maybe around 7 p.m., on what we would call Saturday night. But what was biblically the start of the first day of the week, or one of the Sabbath. I hope that's clear. And either way, whether it's one of the Sabbaths as a 7 Sabbath count to Pentecost, or one of the Sabbath as a day of the week counting, the reality of what even the Greek preserves for us is the centrality of the Sabbath as the reference to all other days of the week. The continued observance of this day is historically and textually unavoidable, as it was a never-ending statute for all of Elohim's people. The children of Israel shall keep the Sabbath to observe the Sabbath throughout their generations. It is an eternal covenant. And now, let's go back to the comparative verse we mentioned in Acts 18. And he, Paul, reasoned in the synagogue every Sabbath and persuaded the Jews and the Greeks. Would it surprise you to know that here it is pan Sabbaton in Greek, not just one or some random Sabbath, but every Sabbath. With some simple context and language background, we can easily read this at face value, without contradiction. Paul was a committed Sabbath keeper, shown here by the fact that he didn't only reason with Jews in the synagogue, but with Greeks. Why would Greeks be there if Sunday was being taught as the day for Gentiles to observe? Well, any convert, including the Gentiles, would meet and fellowship and observe the one day that has been established forever as Adonai's holy day. It's not Jewish. It's not only for native Israelites. It is covenantal. And it wasn't only Paul's practice or the disciples. It was Yeshua's. And as was his practice, he, Yeshua, went to the synagogue on the Sabbath day and he stood up to read. If our primary objective is to walk as Yeshua walked, then I struggle to understand how this even became a debate. But actually, I do have some idea. To be thorough, I'll quickly mention one more reference to a Sunday-based worship in the New Testament. In fact, the only other one that isn't describing the day of Yeshua's resurrection, which happens on the first day of the week according to Torah instruction for the Feast of Unleavened Bread, when the first sheaf of barley is waved before Adonai. But that aside, let's look at 1 Corinthians 16. On the first day of the week, each of you is to put something aside and store it up, as he may prosper, so that there will be no collecting when I come. Church doctrine teaches this as a proof of a Sunday worship service on the first day of the week, imparting the modern practice of collecting money on Sunday to give for the pastor's salary. And the Greek again uses on one of the Sabbath. But why? To introduce Sunday tithing? No, Paul is actually trying to separate the notion of the assembly giving gifts to support his ministry expenses from the practice of bringing actual tithes or offerings to the temple on Shabbat. As a quick note, remember that 1 Corinthians is written in context of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, just like Acts 20 is. So it's interesting that all 8 instances of this phrase in the New Testament is directly related to the Sabbaths between Passover and Pentecost. The irony here is that so many teach that this is supporting a Sunday worship, when it's literally Paul denying the distraction of exchanging and or collecting of monies on the holy Sabbath, and instead moving that to the first day of the week, which is a business day, in keeping with the Tanakh ordinances of closing the city gates from merchandise from Friday until Sunday. As Hebrews states, "So then, there remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God, for whoever has entered God's rest has also rested from his works as God did from his." The whole context in Hebrews 4 is that those who didn't obey Adonai didn't enter the promised land. Those who don't enter his rest, in verse 5, are those who fail to enter because of disobedience. Disobedience to what? The living word of Elohim. Because in that word he declares that the Sabbath is a covenant sign for whomever wants to be called his people. Therefore, the people of Israel shall keep the Sabbath, observing the Sabbath throughout their generations, as a covenant forever. It is a sign forever between me and the people of Israel that in 6 days Adonai made heaven and earth, and on the 7th day he rested and was refreshed. If you're thinking, that verse is just for Israel, but the church is different, then please go watch the Gospel Series Part 3 and 4 videos again. And furthermore, what this verse connects is that observing this set-apart Sabbath day is what actually declares whether you believe that Adonai is the creator of the world. And as is stated twice, just in these 2 verses, is that it is forever. Here's a question. Can Paul change Adonai's definition of forever? The answer to that can be found in the repairing of these suspected contradictions that we began with. Paul was not lukewarm and did whatever was instructed by the Torah and prophets because he believed the Sabbath was God's covenant marker instituted from the beginning. Paul also observed the Sabbath. Therefore, he would never try to convince others it was done away with, because Yeshua faithfully kept Sabbath, and Paul imitated him. And now we can correct the assumptions according to this truth. 1. Sunday is anecdotal. It is not prescribed by biblical authority. 2. Those who followed Yeshua continued to gather on Sabbath, the 7th day of the week, never replacing it with Sunday, the first day of the week. 3. Paul continued the observance of Sabbath and had no authority to establish Sunday worship as a new sacrament for Christianity. So that's enough to consider for now. I encourage you to share this and study it with trusted seekers of the Word, and to subscribe to catch the next episode. And until next time, let's pray for the mercy of Adonai to open our eyes to His truth, and for the courage to walk in it. Shalom.